Welcome to the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery.
All right, diving right in. Today we're all about business storytelling. You've handed us Putting Stories to Work by Shawn Callahan. And it's got me thinking, how often do we underestimate the power of a good story, especially at work?
It's more common than you might think. Callahan makes a really interesting point about focusing on oral storytelling, the kind of stories we share naturally, not crafted narratives. He believes these hold untapped potential for leaders.
That's a fresh perspective. We're so used to thinking about written communication in a business setting. But like you said, these everyday stories, the ones we swap at the water cooler or in the elevator, they've got this raw energy, don't they?
They absolutely do. And Callahan illustrates this with a great example. A manager named Peter who needed to pitch a budget to his company's board.
Oh, budget meetings. Those are usually snooze fests. What did Peter do differently?
He ditched the PowerPoint and went full-on storyteller. For 15 minutes, he laid out his vision, not through charts and graphs, but a compelling narrative about what he wanted to achieve.
So it was more about painting a picture, creating a shared understanding of the goal.
Exactly. And it worked brilliantly. The board was captivated, they approved his request without hesitation, and even asked if he needed more funding to reach his goals faster.
Wow. That speaks volumes, doesn't it? It's like data can inform, but stories truly persuade.
It's about making an emotional connection. The board chair was so impressed, he instructed other managers to follow Peter's example. That's influence in action.
Okay. That's a solid point for storytelling and leadership. But how does this translate to employee engagement? Is there a connection there?
Definitely. Callahan highlights a study by Adam Grant that looked at different ways to motivate call center workers raising money. One group focused on the money they'd earn. The other group heard stories about how their work directly impacted the lives of those they were helping.
So it was about connecting the dots between their daily tasks and the bigger purpose, right?
You got it. The results were incredible. The group motivated by stories of impact raised more than double the donations compared to the group focused on their wages.
That's amazing. It reminds me of that saying, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. Stories seem to be the perfect bridge between the two.
Absolutely. Stories give us context and purpose. They help us understand the why behind our actions, and that can be incredibly motivating, especially in a work setting.
It's like tapping into that intrinsic drive, isn't it? It's not just about a paycheck anymore. It's about contributing to something meaningful. Now, Callahan also talks about storytelling's role in building trust, and he shares a pretty compelling anecdote about a pharmaceutical CEO facing a tricky situation.
Yes, this CEO was approached by a powerful politician who wanted preferential treatment for his wife in a clinical trial. This put the CEO in a tough spot, having to balance ethics with potential repercussions.
I bet that took some serious integrity to navigate. So how did the CEO handle it?
He held his ground. He explained that the trial had strict protocols that couldn't be compromised. Even for someone influential, the CEO refused to give special treatment.
That's a powerful statement. It wasn't just about following procedures. It was about demonstrating a commitment to fairness and transparency.
Exactly. That story wasn't about a rule book. It revealed the CEO's character. By sharing this story, it sent a powerful message to employees about the company's values and that their leader walks the talk.
Right. Actions speak louder than words, but stories give those actions meaning and make them stick. I can see how that builds trust. Knowing that your leader is guided by principles, not swayed by pressure.
Absolutely. Stories like that resonate deeply, especially in a world where corporate scandals and ethical lapses are all too common. They offer a glimpse into the soul of an organization, wouldn't you say?
Completely. And this brings us to the fascinating realm of decision-making. I'm curious, how do stories influence those sometimes tough choices we make?
Callahan argues that stories shape our intuition. Think about it. We often rely on our gut feeling when making decisions. And those gut feelings are heavily influenced by the narratives we've absorbed.
So it's not just about cold, hard facts, but how we interpret those facts through the lens of stories.
Precisely. The book shares an example of U.S. workers visiting a Japanese factory. Initially, they were skeptical about the high productivity they observed, dismissing it as staged. However, witnessing the night shift working with the same intensity completely shifted their perspective.
It was the power of seeing it firsthand. Experiencing it through a story, that changed their minds.
Yes. The story provided context that data alone couldn't convey. It challenged their assumptions and led them to a new understanding.
That's a great illustration of how stories can be a powerful tool for breaking down biases. But I'm also thinking about the potential downsides. I mean, if stories can shape our intuition so strongly, couldn't they also lead us astray?
That's a great point. And it's something Callahan addresses directly through a personal anecdote. He was working with a logistics company, trying to help them craft a strategy story. But the executives were too busy to collaborate directly.
Uh-oh, I sense this might not end well. What happened?
They asked him to interview them individually and then piece together a story from those conversations. Callahan knew this wasn't ideal, but agreed to proceed anyway.
I'm already cringing. I can feel the disconnect brewing.
He presented the story he'd painstakingly created, only to have the CEO interrupt him a few sentences in and declare, "All stories are lies." They fired him the next day.
Oh, wow. Talk about a harsh lesson.
It was a painful experience, but it drove home a critical point that Callahan emphasizes throughout the book. Authenticity matters. You can't just force a story into existence. It needs to be genuine and rooted in truth.
It's like the difference between giving a presentation and truly connecting with your audience. One is informative, the other is transformative.
Exactly. And that authenticity is crucial to understanding why stories are often more persuasive than facts alone. There's a fascinating study mentioned in the book where participants were given factual information about a fire.
Okay, so we're talking about a fire. Factual information. What's the story in all this?
Some participants also received a plausible story, suggesting arson is the cause. Surprisingly, the story led people to doubt the factual information, even though there was no evidence to support arson.
That's fascinating. It seems a compelling story can overshadow even hard evidence. Why do you think we're so susceptible to narratives?
Stories paint a complete picture, a framework that's harder to dismantle with isolated facts. Think of it like a puzzle. Once you see the image, it's tough to view the pieces independently. Stories provide that cohesive image.
That makes sense. It's like the story gives those facts a context, a reason to care. Data informs, but stories make it personal.
Exactly. And that's where oral storytelling really shines. It's leaner, more direct, cutting to the chase, unlike dense written accounts.
So it's about capturing the essence of the experience, not getting bogged down in details.
Right. Callahan compares different tellings of the JFK assassination. The written form is comprehensive but lengthy. In contrast, the oral version is more like, "We recreated the shooting, and Oswald couldn't have made those shots."
It's about impact, isn't it? Getting to the heart of the matter quickly, like a punchline that makes you rethink everything.
It is. Oral storytelling is also more natural, conversational, making it easier to connect with the listener. We're wired for this. The book delves into how storytelling predates language itself, a fundamental human communication tool.
It's fascinating to think about that, our deep-rooted need for stories. It's like we crave meaning and connection, and stories are the key.
Absolutely. Long before spoken language, stories helped us understand the world, build communities, and ultimately survive.
It's that inherent drive to make sense of things, find patterns in chaos. Stories help us do just that, whether it's around a campfire or a boardroom table. Speaking of, Callahan introduces this concept of small stories, those brief, everyday anecdotes. Why does he place such emphasis on them?
Their power lies in their relatability and emotional impact. They cut through the noise and make a point in a memorable way. It's about recognizing their value, incorporating them into your messaging, and actively listening for them in others. Callahan encourages leaders to make storytelling a habit.
That's a great concept, story listening. It's about creating a space for people to feel safe sharing their experiences. Like instead of saying, "Tell me about a time you succeeded."
You could try something like, "What was a challenge you faced recently, and how did you overcome it?" That invites a richer, more authentic narrative.
It's about opening the door for those powerful personal stories to emerge. Now, Callahan also distinguishes between genuine stories and what he calls non-stories. What are some signs we might be falling into that trap?
He gives an example. We're a leader in our industry. We have the best people. We listen to our customers. It sounds impressive, but lacks the elements of a true story.
Yeah, it's more like a list of claims, a marketing pitch, rather than a compelling narrative.
Exactly. It's missing that crucial element of change or challenge that defines a genuine story. To help us identify real stories, Callahan suggests looking for time markers, character actions, and ultimately, a transformation or shift.
So it's about asking, when did this happen, who did what, and what changed as a result?
Precisely. And once you start noticing these elements, you'll be surprised how many stories are hidden in plain sight. Callahan encourages us to develop a search image for stories.
It's like training our minds to be story spotters, noticing the narratives unfolding around us. But finding stories is just the first step. Callahan also talks about actively triggering stories, creating situations that inspire them.
He shares a great example involving John Mars, the chairman of Mars Inc. During a presentation at a factory, a fluorescent light started flickering. Without a word, Mars grabbed the ladder, climbed up, and fixed the light while the presentation continued.
It's not just about fixing the light, is it? It's about embodying a company value, taking ownership.
Exactly. It was a powerful, unspoken story about leadership and responsibility, a moment that likely resonated with everyone present.
That's a fantastic illustration of leading by example. You're not just telling people the values, you're showing them through action, sparking those positive stories. But what about those stories we want to hold on to, the ones we hear from others or experience ourselves? How do we ensure they stick with us?
That's where Callahan's Remember discipline comes into play. He suggests techniques like tagging stories with keywords, summarizing key plot points, and using vivid imagery to embed them in our memories. It's about creating our own story bank.
I love that image. Having a mental repository of these powerful narratives ready to draw upon. But isn't there more to it than just memorization?
You're right. We tend to remember things that evoke emotions, things that surprise us or pique our curiosity. So when trying to remember a story, focus on its emotional core, the unexpected twists, the vibrant details that make it stand out.
It's about internalizing the story, not just the words. The more it resonates with us, the more easily it comes to mind when we need it.
And don't underestimate the power of repetition. Retelling a story, whether to a friend or colleague, helps solidify it in your memory. You could even record them in a way that makes sense for you, maybe a one-liner capturing the essence, or noting key plot points and tagging them with themes.
It's about making those stories accessible, creating a system that works for you. So we've explored finding stories, remembering them. Now let's talk about sharing them effectively. What are the hallmarks of a good business story?
A truly effective business story goes beyond entertainment. It changes behavior and inspires action. Callahan highlights a small story about a boss giving an employee her undivided attention. It sounds simple, but the impact is significant.
Because it's relatable, right? We've all craved that feeling of being truly heard and seen. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures can have the biggest impact.
Exactly. And it's about selecting the right type of story for the situation. Callahan outlines different categories: connection stories for building rapport, clarity stories to explain decisions, influence stories for persuasion, and success stories for motivation.
It's like having the right tool for the job. You wouldn't use a hammer to screw on a light bulb, and you wouldn't use a motivational story when you need to build trust.
Precisely. It's about being strategic and understanding the desired outcome. But with this power comes responsibility, right? We've discussed how stories shape our beliefs and actions, which raises ethical considerations.
Absolutely. How does Callahan address the potential for manipulation?
He dedicates an entire chapter to the ethics of business storytelling. He discusses the spectrum of influence, the importance of self-awareness, and seeking feedback to ensure we're using stories ethically.
So it's not just about telling a good story, it's about telling the right story for the right reasons and ensuring it aligns with our values.
Exactly. He stresses the responsibility leaders have in amplifying positive stories. While dampening those that are harmful or go against company values, it's about consciously shaping culture through the narratives we choose to share.
That makes sense. It's like being a curator of stories, selecting those with the most positive impact. Now, Callahan also talks about refreshing stories, recognizing when they've run their course. Why is that important?
He shares a personal example about a story he used to tell about his colleague, Dave Snowden, who introduced him to story work. It always got positive reactions. But after a falling out with Snowden, people started interpreting it negatively.
So the same story, told in a different context or with a changed perspective, can land entirely differently.
Yes. It's a reminder to be mindful of how our stories are received, being open to feedback, and willing to retire those that no longer serve us or our audience.
It's about being aware of the evolving nature of stories and their impact. We're not just telling them, we're constantly refining and adapting them.
Exactly. It's a dynamic process. Callahan emphasizes this through an anecdote about collecting stories at a power plant. He heard 4 different versions of the same event, each told from a unique perspective.
It highlights that there isn't one right way to tell a story. Interpretation and context play a huge role.
Right. And it reinforces the need for feedback and being adaptable in our approach.
So it's an ongoing conversation, constantly evolving. Now, after all this insightful exploration, what are some key takeaways you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that storytelling isn't some mystical art form. It's a skill anyone can develop. And Callahan gives us a practical roadmap with his 4 disciplines of story mastery.
That's right. Discover, remember, share, refresh. A framework for making storytelling a conscious practice. Let's break it down for our listener. What does each discipline entail?
Discover is about being attuned to the stories around us. It's actively listening for those anecdotes and conversations, observing those small moments that reveal character or values.
It's like we're surrounded by these narrative gems, but we need to train our ears and eyes to spot them. And then remember, how do we make sure these stories stick with us?
Callahan offers some great techniques, like tagging stories with keywords, visualizing key moments, and even summarizing the core message in a punchy one-liner. It's about creating our own personal story bank.
That's such a great visual, a treasure chest of stories just waiting to be shared. And then comes the share discipline. It's not just about telling any story, though, is it?
It's about being strategic. What story best serves the moment? Is it a connection story to build rapport, a clarity story to explain a complex decision, or perhaps an influence story to persuade someone?
It's like choosing the right tool from our storytelling toolkit. And finally, we have refresh. Why is it important to revisit and even retire certain stories?
Because context changes, our understanding evolves, and stories can land differently over time. Callahan encourages us to be open to feedback, to notice if a story isn't resonating as it once did, and to have the courage to let go of those that no longer serve us.
It's about recognizing that storytelling is a living process, constantly adapting to the situation. And it's about being sensitive to how our stories are received, making sure they're aligned with our values and the impact we want to create.
Exactly. And Callahan provides a fantastic case study in PIRCH, a company that sells high-end appliances. What sets them apart is their dedication to weaving storytelling into every facet of their business.
So it's not just about having a few good marketing anecdotes. It's about embedding storytelling into their culture, right? Tell me more about their approach.
Their employees are encouraged to share stories, to connect with customers on a personal level, creating those memorable moments that build loyalty and trust. They've created a culture where everyone is a storyteller, sharing authentic experiences that resonate with their clientele.
It sounds like they're really walking the talk, not just using stories as a surface-level tactic. It's about genuineness, creating those human connections that go beyond the transaction.
Exactly. And it ties back to the ethical considerations we discussed earlier. Callahan uses the example of Robert Cialdini, the influence expert, who was once approached by a fan describing a manipulative sales technique. Cialdini was clearly disturbed by this misuse of his work.
It's a powerful reminder that influence, especially through storytelling, should never be used to deceive or manipulate. There's a responsibility that comes with this power.
And Callahan gives us practical guidelines to ensure ethical storytelling. For example, ask yourself, would I want to be on the receiving end of this story? Would I be comfortable sharing this story publicly? It's about honesty, transparency, and respect.
Those are fantastic checks. It's about aligning our actions with our values, making sure our storytelling is driven by integrity.
Precisely. And it extends to even challenging situations, like explaining a difficult decision, such as letting someone go. Callahan emphasizes the need for clear, compassionate communication, even in those tough moments.
It's about leading with empathy, recognizing that our stories impact others, and that we have a responsibility to handle those narratives with care.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that different people will interpret the same story through their own lens. Callahan shares an anecdote about collecting stories at a power plant, where he heard 4 different versions of the same event, each influenced by the teller's perspective.
It's a great reminder that there's no one right way to tell a story. We need to be open to different interpretations and adapt our approach accordingly.
And that circles back to the idea of deliberate practice. Storytelling is an ongoing journey, a continuous process of refining our skills and deepening our understanding.
It's not about reaching some mythical level of mastery. It's about embracing the process, learning from each experience, and using that knowledge to become more effective communicators. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of business storytelling, what are some final thoughts you'd like to leave our listener with?
I think it comes down to this. Stories are powerful. They shape our understanding, influence our choices, and connect us to a shared sense of purpose. And we all have stories within us waiting to be discovered, shared, and used to make a positive impact.
Absolutely. And it all starts with paying attention. Notice the stories swirling around you. Consider how you can frame your own ideas with compelling narratives. And remember that with practice, anyone can harness this incredible tool.
It's about becoming more conscious of the power of stories. and using that power wisely and ethically.
That's a great point to end on. So to our listener, here's a challenge. What stories are shaping the culture of your workplace? What stories are you telling about yourself? And are they helping you reach your goals? We invite you to embrace the power of storytelling and become the narrator of your own success.
See you next time on the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. Until next time.
See you then.